This is Powerlust. It's a little multiplayer shooter I've been working on for the past few months. You can think of it as Overwatch, but 2D. The main mechanic of the game is that all combat is based around lifesteal. You can shoot another player and deal 10 damage, and then you'll heal 10 health. This can lead to some very interesting situations, where you encounter an enemy, but you're on low health and they have full health, but you win the fight and suddenly they're the one on low health. And it honestly makes fights so much more exciting, because you may be winning the fight right now, but if you let your guard down for even a fraction of a second, it could get out of your control. In this video, I'll be going over the entirety of development so far, from the very beginnings to what you see now, as well as the struggles involved and much more. Let's get into it. First things first, I needed to get the basics of multiplayer networking out of the way, because you can't have a multiplayer game without multiplayer. This turned out to be a fairly easy task thanks to the fact that I have messed around with multiplayer networking before. So after a few hours of work, I managed to get clients to connect to the server and join rooms. Although relatively simple, it was a very dull task as I had to write a lot of code just to get some basic systems working. And I also needed to relearn some things. Feeling happy with the result, I took a break and started working on player movement, which I might have accidentally copied from my previous game Cataclysm, with a few modifications of course. I removed everything that would not be necessary to the game, like some movement mechanics featured in that game, and also all of the polish, because I would add that later. It functions and also works with multiplayer after a bit of work, but as you can see, it's not very interesting. I would also like to point out the placeholder UI, because it was interesting, but it was functional, and that's what matters, at least for now. As you can see, we have a loading screen with text that changes and tells us what the computer is actually doing, so you can see if it gets stuck on anything. Then we load into the main menu, which will hopefully look a lot better in the future, but for now it's also boring. We have two buttons, one that will allow us to join a random game, and another that simply closes the game. When joining a game, you get shown this screen titled game_waiting for players_test. Inside, you'll just see text that says player, followed by a bunch of random numbers. This is the player list, and it shows you how many players are inside a room as well as their username. Like in this image here with 8 clients connected to one room, you can see how many players there are and also what their usernames are, whereas in this image with only 2 clients, you can see there are in fact only 2 players. The next day, I got to work adding some more functionality to the waiting for players screen. I added auto starting so that you don't need to press a little button in the top corner to start the game, because that button will probably be removed eventually. Now, if you wait long enough after getting into the waiting screen with enough players in it, you will automatically be put into the game. Next, I added an important feature to the game. When you load in, you will now be assigned to a team. As this is a team-based game, this will be very important for the future. At the moment, the only thing that really changes is the color of your player character. Of course, in the future, this will determine who you can attack and who you cannot. I also started working on the very basics of multiplayer combat. I added a basic weapon, which shoots a projectile whenever you press the left mouse button. Obviously, this is a bit overpowered, as you can simply get an auto-clicker and spam projectiles everywhere, but in the future I'll probably add a fire rate cap. For the next few days, I was working hard on multiplayer combat. There are a lot of bugs and headaches involved with this, as I have to sort out the interactions between different clients, and quite often they don't really feel like cooperating, but I was getting near finalizing the combat, until I discovered a big problem with the lifesteal system. It was incredibly inconsistent. After doing some testing, I discovered that when you shot another player and they shot back and you had a little fight, and then you looked at your health and suddenly there was some extra health. Where did it come from? After doing heaps of testing, I discovered that it was because the way I tried to implement it, while being more efficient, was also not very smart. I don't really know how I didn't pick up on it while I was programming it in. Basically, at the moment, the way lifesteal works was when you hit an enemy on your client, you would get healed by the damage of the projectile. And then on the other client, when they got hit by the projectile, they took damage. However, occasionally, you would hit a projectile on your client, but on their client, they wouldn't get hit. Which means you heal 10 health, but they haven't taken damage, so 10 health just appeared out of thin air. And considering how important it is to the game that energy doesn't appear out of thin air, this was a massive issue. so I had to get to work on fixing it. Basically what I did was I made it so that when you got hit by a projectile on your client, the enemy that owned that projectile would get healed for the amount of damage that it did to you. And after some more testing, I discovered that this in fact did work a lot better. After getting the combat mostly working, I had a bit of a play around with Unity's 2D lighting system, as I thought it would be the easiest way to hide enemy players behind walls. In my game, I wanted visibility to be very limited, so you could only see what was around you and not through walls, with the idea that it would make multiplayer combat more interesting, because if they ran out of your sight, you would now have no idea where they went, so they could make a getaway or hide around the corner and perform a surprise attack when you walk around the corner. A few days later, I made a lot of progress on the game. I added a very important mechanic, which is commonly known as death. Previously, when you reached 0 health, you would simply be disconnected from the server, but obviously that couldn't stay for very long. Now when you die, you disappear and then reappear at some random spawn point moments later. What happens behind the scene is that you get teleported off to some location on the map and your camera gets disabled. This happens because if I simply destroyed the player when they died, it would cause a lot of problems. So after a few seconds, the player gets moved back with full health and their camera gets unfrozen. I also worked on an important part of the game, which I like to refer to as the energy economy. This is a term I use to describe the flow of energy around the game, because in Powerlust, every point of energy will continue to circulate around the game indefinitely. So I set up the cores. The cores are a big battery thing that stores the excess energy in the game, so if you have 100 health and you shoot someone and steal 10 health, the excess energy isn't sent to your health bar because then you would have more than your maximum amount of health. Instead, it's sent to your core and just stored there until when you need energy. For example, if you need healing or when your health gets refilled upon respawning, it gets taken out of your core. There will also be a physical core in your team's base in the future that will be able to be attacked and allow you to steal energy from the enemy team, but I haven't gotten around to implementing that yet. There's a tiny little thing I haven't mentioned about the energy economy yet though. When you respawn, there's a little penalty that is taken out of your core and completely removed from circulation. So after a few deaths, the amount of energy in the game will reduce, and at the very end of the game it will be very hectic because there will be very little energy to circulate around. So if you die, it's going to be a bit of a pain for your teammates to try and bring you back to life, because if there's no energy in the core, you can't respawn. Next, I decided to take a break from all the complicated multiplayer networking stuff and decided to turn my attention to the UI. I pulled out some paper and drew a basic design of what I wanted the UI to look like. I took inspiration from some modern UI designs with rounded panels and basic colors, and my end result looked like this. It looks a lot better than before, but in my opinion it could still use some work, and I might redesign it so it looks less confusing. The buttons on the left side of the menu are the different sub-menus, and they show different content. The topmost one, the only one that doesn't have a label that says coming soon, will show the play menu, which is what is currently visible. The play menu has stuff like find a game, as well as some other things that you might find useful. The other menus will have other things in them, but of course, they're coming soon. However, I noticed that players kept clicking the play sub-menu button before realizing that they actually needed to press the find game button, and that's a bit confusing, I realized, so I am definitely going to change that in the future. I also redesigned the waiting for players menu, and well, here's a quick before and after. As you can see, it looks a lot better with designated spots for each player on the player list, as well as a badge that displays their account level, which, again, will probably come in the future, and also a spot for their username and profile picture. In the middle, you can see the timer, which used to be hiding in the bottom left corner, but I moved it into the middle so it's more obvious. And in the top right, you still have the placeholder for start and extend the wait buttons, but that's another thing for the future. The next day, I started working on overhauling the HUD, because I wasn't a massive fan of the random numbers placed all over the screen. You can now see the upgraded health bar with text that shows the player's username on it. I'm still not sure about the health bar because it can be a bit hard to read. I'm not sure what else I could make it look like, but I guess I'll try and find find a solution in the future. There's also an energy bar up the top that shows the distribution of all the game's energy between the two teams. The energy bar is the amount of energy that each player on the team has added to the amount of energy that their core has. It took me a long time to work out how to find the health values of each player because that is stored privately. So I had to make some special modifications to the way everything worked, but I think that it's worth it because it provides some useful information to the player that will definitely come in handy. It was about this point in development where we held the first major Powerlust playtesting session with a few friends. The game was getting closer and closer to the minimum version I had set out to try and complete before the end of the year, and at that point it was still November. In this playtesting session, we discovered that the game was actually extremely fun. We all really enjoyed ourselves, and even though the game was still extremely buggy and unpolished, it had a lot of potential. So after the playtesting session, I got to work making the game better. Now that I had proven this game could be good, I was extremely motivated to work on the project, so I did. I immediately got to work on the first map for the game. First of all, I had to actually design the map, and this was a bit of a challenge. I wasn't really sure how I wanted the map to look or how big I wanted it to be. But after getting into it, I might have gone a bit overboard. I decided to go for a space station. I'm not exactly sure why, I just thought it could be cool. Anyway, here's the design, and as you can see, it is very complicated. It's got lots of tiny corridors and rooms, as well as some larger areas that are better for fighting in. Sure, it might be a bit large, but I could always change it later. After getting the design sorted, I needed to consider how I would actually implement the map. I couldn't use normal objects to build it because it would be very hard to measure out distances and almost impossible to have nice transitions between different objects. Whatever I did would end up with a seam between two objects at the corners. I considered using sprite shape to do the work, but it's more useful for organic structures. My final option was Unity's tile map system. It had a major upside that it would be really convenient to build and make modifications to the map, but it also meant that I would have to make perfectly tiling sprites, and that seemed like an extraordinarily difficult task. But it's what I eventually decided to go with, as it was the best option. That was until I ran into a massive issue. After building the tiny little center area in the middle of the map, I discovered that it was very laggy. It brought my FPS all the way down to 30, and that's not really good considering how small the map was at the time. So I needed a way to optimize the tile map system. I looked online, but there weren't really any viable solutions there, so I had to work it out myself. I created a list of 4 items that could potentially increase the performance of the tile map, and if this didn't work, then I would be in a lot of trouble as I didn't really have any other options. The first item on the list was very simple, and it was just to reduce the size of the map. By doing so, it would mean that the overall result was less laggy. Next was larger tiles. I would increase the size of the tile map grid so that each tile was larger. This means that I could make a map that was larger, but still having it technically the same size. Next is to lower the sprite quality, and that basically means reducing the graphics quality of each tile so they aren't so hard to render. This one would have been important because I usually like to render graphics to a pretty high quality. Usually I go for 1024 pixels by 1024 pixels. So by reducing the size of each sprite that is rendered, it could significantly increase the performance because each tile does not take up 1000 pixels, it only takes up a few. And then last on the list is chunking. Chunking is something I didn't really want to have to implement, as it would be a lot of work and would barely be worth it. It basically means that I split the map into multiple different tile maps and enable and disable them as the player moves around, so only a small portion of the map is visible at a time. This would probably increase the performance quite a bit. It would also make the map considerably more annoying to make, and I didn't want that. So I got to work implementing these changes in order, but as I got to chunking, I decided that I would test the map first, because if there was a chance I wouldn't have to implement it, I would take it. And after a short test with the map about twice as large as before, I had 170 FPS, which is very good, especially considering with a map half the size, it was only running at about 45 FPS before. So now I had to actually start working on the map. After making all the sprites, I simply had to draw them wherever to create the map, and after a few hours of work, I got a mostly finished version of the map. And I recorded a time-lapse of it. so you can watch me put together this map. You might notice that it is a very different design to the original map, but that's just because I am too scared of going too big, because it would probably impact performance quite a bit. Not only that, but I think this size map would be better suited for a 5v5 match anyway. Now, you might notice those lighter grey areas in the map. Those are actually windows. I had a little idea where I could add a space background and then allow you to see that through windows in the floor placed throughout the map, and after making the background it does work, and I think it looks very nice. However, the windows do have a side effect that I actually really like. Because the space background is not affected by lighting, you can see the windows through walls, but when someone is standing on top of one of the windows, they block your view, so you can actually see players through walls if they're standing on windows. You can't tell what team they're on, but it is possible, and I find that really cool. Next, I started working on some polishing stuff. I added a leaderboard to the game where you can see all the players in the game and their stats. In this image, you can see 2 players in the game. One player has 1 kill, the other player has 1 death, and they both have a balanced score, which is basically how much energy they have stolen from other players minus the amount that they have lost. You can also see at the bottom of the screen a little kill notification that pops up when you kill someone. I also added this screen. It shows up when the game ends and tells you whether you won or lost, along with some text that lets you know what happened. There's also a really cool feature here where it shows the best player of each team. This is simply calculated by checking who has the highest balance, but I think it's a neat little touch. Now that that was all done, there wasn't that much left for the update, but there were a few little things that needed to be cleaned up, so I got to work on that. There are a lot of little sound effects that I needed to add that I hadn't gotten around to before, like a sound effect that plays when you take damage, and a sound effect that plays when a projectile breaks. I don't think I mentioned this before, but I will mention it now. The visual effects and sound effects are a little more complicated in this game than others, because usually you can just spawn sound effects. But in this game, I wanted to have them synchronized between clients, so maybe if you shoot a projectile, then other players who are nearby will be able to hear it. So I have to call a separate function to synchronize the sound effects. This also simplifies it as much as possible, so I don't have to send very much information over the network. And because of that, there's a lot of stuff I can't really do with particle effects, like giving them a custom rotation or extra information or whatever without making heaps of prefabs, but the upside is well worth it in my opinion. It also uses a spatial sound system, so that it gets louder and quieter depending on how far away they are. I also added a little feature which I call dynamic game starting energy. Normally when you load into the game, each team starts with 2,500 energy, but now you still start with 2,500 energy, but only when you have a full game of 10 players. For each player that enters the game adds 500 energy to the total pool. So if you have, say, 3 players in total, there will be 1,500 energy in the pool. Then the pool is split evenly between each team, so in this case, each team will have 750 starting energy. This makes games with less than 10 players shorter, because otherwise it just gets boring after a while. I also added a little notification that pops up when an enemy attacks your core, and it was a bit of a pain to implement, but I am definitely glad I did, because when there's a lot of things going on, it is very difficult to work out if someone's attacking your core, but luckily that's not the problem anymore. There are a lot of bugs and stuff that were fixed, and also this little cutscene thing that shows at the start of the game, and it just shows your teammates and the enemies. At this point the update is basically done. However, I can't actually complete it yet because I still need to organize a playtesting session and then make this video. So in the meantime, I decided to continue working on the game and just add a bunch of random little things while I wait for the playtesting session. The larger of these little things were 2 balance additions. The first being dynamic respawn time. This changes the respawn time of your team based on the amount of energy your team has. So if you have most of the energy, you get shorter respawn time, whereas the other team gets longer respawn time. And this is also based off of a ratio. If you have 10 energy out of the 100 energy in the game, or 1000 energy out of the 10,000 energy in the game, you will end up with the same respawn time in both cases. And this helps the game progress faster, because the team with the most energy will respawn faster and will be able to win easier. The second thing I did was to add a little thing I call the core buff. When your core gets attacked, it can sometimes be hard to defeat the enemy who is at the core. So instead I made it so you gain a little buff to your movement speed, reload time, and damage reduction when you're near your core. If there's enemies attacking your core, you can fight them off easier. And as a side effect of this, if you're good enough, you can actually handle 2v1s or 3v1s or more easier because you have a little buff. Now, the very last thing on the to-do list was music. I needed to make a main theme for the game, and this was something I'd been trying to do for ages, but I never managed to make anything that I liked enough to set to be the main theme for the game. But of course, I eventually did it, and created something that not only works, but I think is pretty good. But before I show you it, here are my favourites of the other attempts. Here's main theme test 1. This one sounds very nice, and I do really like it, but I decided not to use it because it just didn't really work when I tried to extend the song, because it's in 3/4 time, and it just didn't really work with some of the other things I tried to do with it. Then main theme test 2, which is probably my favourite, and I might actually use it for the game as some alternate theme or something, because it is very nice. But the issue is it doesn't really fit the mood. It's like kind of scary sounding, kind of ominous, and it just doesn't really work for the main theme of the game. So of course I gave it another go. And now we have the actual main theme. It starts off very electricity sounding, which was what I was going for because, well, this is Powerlust. But then after a while we get the B section, which has a very different sound to it. And that's the current state of the game today. I hope you enjoyed this insight into the development of the game, as it took me ages to make. The script alone is more than twice as long as my typical devlog script, and the audio recording so far, unedited, is almost half an hour. If you're interested in more content by me, maybe go check out this video where I try to make a game in 1 hour, and it actually goes reasonably well. It's slightly edited so you can see how I made the game step by step, but with all the boring parts cut out. It's worth a watch in my opinion. Also, if you want more Powerlust content, this video here is where I explain the game in more detail, and it also has background footage of the first playtesting session, which I mentioned earlier. And if you want even more, then make sure you subscribe and turn notifications on so you don't miss them when I release them. Anyway, that's it from me this year. Have a great 2023 everyone. Bye.